Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Hatchet, the original 2006 film. So, going into Hatchet, I think the main reason why I justify watching this movie is really just because I eventually saw this show called Holliston on like just kind of a random thing of just like, hey, let's see this show because it looked kind of unique enough. And so I watched that show, and they are to have, or there was to have a Hatchet reference of like people who were from the cast of Hatchet being on that show, and I was like, well, okay, like let me just kind of see like what Hatchet is about, because I really just wanted to kind of see something like this. The kills are very gruesome in this film. I'll say that right away. But there seems to be a large cluster of also topless women in this movie, also. The guy who ended up directing and writing this movie also was on the show Holliston. He ends up making a little like guest appearance in this movie, so it's kind of funny to retroactively go from Holliston to now watching this, and I probably should have done the reverse, but I wasn't thinking about it. So, going into this, what is Hatchet about for people that don't know what this is? Well, this movie takes kind of New Orleans and kind of the swamplands, which for like a horror film, like I haven't seen that done quite often, so bravo for that idea. But really, this show is, of course, to be themed around Mardi Gras, where, of course, you have a bunch of topless women who are to get chucked beads at them and to go and take their clothes off for however amount of beads. Because, of course, if anybody's ever heard of Mardi Gras in their life, anyways, pushing on. So, uh, really, I like how the kills seem really interesting in this movie, but you also have to like question like the strength of a person. But like, really, you're just to have fun with this film. Really to just see again, just a cluster of just women who are to take their top off in this movie. Like, I guess that's the huge appeal, I guess, of this film. Beyond its kind of gory or gross out humor kind of thing. We're also to see certain parts where people are to barf or Ralph in this film. And I'm like, is that where Halston kind of got like parts where like it continued to go with its gross out humor? Because I'm sure the person that wrote this movie also wrote that show. Um, and there is to be like one gag that I think one of the characters is to have on that show. And I'm just like, did they get that from this? Like, because there's this one part where Ben is to eventually try and make fun of his friend, but he ends up like quickly giving up. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, I know that that's the consistent joke in Holliston where we have the one guy who's trying to make fun of his friend and then he quickly gives up. Like, that's the consistent joke of that like show where the guy ends up trying to come up with something and then gives up. So it's like, oh, so that's where this comes from. It's kind of interesting to kind of see the kind of the where eventually these things eventually went to and whatever. We also seem to have both Robert Englund and, of course, Kane Hodder in this movie, which is kind of really interesting. We also have Mercedes McNabb, who I have, of course, seen her in like Buffy and Angel and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting to see her kind of being here. But also we have Joel David Moore, who like I know from like Grandma's Boy and like a cluster of other things at some point. But anyways, so going into this movie, like, what would be, I guess, the weird grading system of which that I'm to go about doing things? Like, I would say that this movie is okay. It honestly has to forcibly have me say that this kind of feels like a taking of a number of things, where it's obviously like a Friday the 13th kind of in the same vein kind of story, and like I can't help but not say that it's basically like, if you have the choice between Friday the 13th and Hatchet, which one are you really going to go with? Like, you're probably going to go with Friday the 13th, and then you're eventually going to go to this movie because the otherwise more kind of nudity nature, or just kind of that it's a lot more of a gory film than quite possibly Friday the 13th can deliver at some points, um, even for Friday the 13th. So yeah, I would say that this movie is probably God, it's probably a solid okay film. Uh, like, you really can see how, like, this movie also kind of feels like Hostel, which came out like the year before this did, where really the beginning of this is like the Hostel characters go in overseas to go to the red light district, and eventually it seems like the theme of that is to have a bunch of Americans want to see something naked kind of thing, and eventually they stumble upon people going and tearing them apart, but for money. So that's where eventually the the Hatchet movie gets lost. But like the beginning of this feels like the beginning of Hostel, but then eventually it morphs into this swampland boat ride where forcibly people go through the wrong swamp tour to eventually stumble upon this Victor Crowley character that had supposedly been humiliated by the people in his town because he was a disfigured child, and leading to his one cabin out in the middle of nowhere getting eventually burnt down. And so, yeah, so like that's the whole story of that, where sadly a disfigured kid um, eventually is to have been um, just had his cabin burned down and was just forced to uh, eventually become this huge rage monster that kills anybody that comes around his land, I guess we were to naturally assume. Anyways, so pushing on. So it's about that customary time to otherwise say it is spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. You know what? I think that this movie could probably work in another medium. Like, if Hatchet was actually put out as a game, I think people would actually play it. Like, I don't know how eventually the other movies are to break down. Maybe there's a better lore of this character, maybe there's just a better approach, or maybe there's just more interesting things to be eventually presented in sequel movies. And maybe at some point, if Hatchet seems to be popular enough, maybe I'll go and check those things out. Like, I know, especially in Hatchet 2, we have a scene where two people are going at it, and all of a sudden, Victor Crowley's to chop the guy's head off, and then the woman who is going in the midst of passion is like, "Oh, hey, baby, you went limp," and then all of a sudden, like, she ends up getting killed also. So I guess like Hatchet 2 is probably the more notable movie, but like, anyways, so let's go into it. Let's go into spoilers. So the very beginning of this film, we have seemingly two hillbilly-ish like characters, Samson and Ainsley, who are to, of course, Samson is Robert Englund's character. They're to be on this boat, and so they're desperately wanting to go and get this certain alligator that I guess is a 12-footer. So really, these characters are just kind of waiting it out for eventual time of which that this gator is going to come a running. And so we have Ainsley who's desperately wanting to pee. And so Samson is like, well, hey, how about you just like go and drop trow right now? Like, we're in the water. You might as well just go and drop trow. So this guy goes and pees, and like he has like performance anxiety. So eventually Ainsley is to be pushed off to go to some brush or some tree or whatever. And so this guy tries to pee yet again. Samson is to mention that there is to be maybe some alligator afoot and just kind of be leery about that. Because Ainsley tries to whip it out right on the boat and the alligator comes flying at them. And so he's like, hey man, I'm not going to go and try to whip this out to lose my winky. So the guy ends up going out into the brush, into the woods, and tries to pee yet again. And what ends up happening instead is Ainsley eventually comes back to the boat and realizes that his father is seemingly gone. But then eventually he ends up finding him, like, basically just torn apart, where you just kind of see, like, seemingly from, like, here up, like, evidently his body had been torn apart by that. So you basically just see Robert Englund's head and, like, part of his chest, and then you just kind of see organs and stuff like that all over the place. And like we're to see like this body, I guess, ripped in half. And then Ainsley's like, oh my god. And then all of a sudden we easily have Ainsley who ends up also getting ripped easily in half as well. Like, I'm sorry, like, isn't there like bone and all that kind of stuff to have like, but then again, when really looking at any movie that we've ever seen, how many times would somebody be easily ripped in half? And now I'm complaining about this movie, like, easily ripping people in half, because also we don't know the exact measurements of how strong this Crowley character really is. Like, I guess he just has to be supernaturally strong compared to anybody else, but that's okay. So, now that that scene's over, we now transition to seemingly a couple guys going through Mardi Gras, and so we end up having Ben and Marcus, who I immediately had forgotten was in Not Another Teen Movie, and I'm seeing him here. I'm like, yeah, I know this guy. Like, I remember him. Like, it's kind of interesting to see certain kind of guys and clusters and people that it looks familiar. But also in this beginning kind of friends of things, we also have the director Adam, who is to also be a part of these friends, but then eventually they separate and go off to their weird thing of wanting to have this swamp boat tour. But anyways, so Ben and Marcus are enjoying Mardi Gras. Consistent women are to be, of course, going topless, getting beads chucked at them. And I'm like, I wonder if they had to pay any of these women, or they had to kind of have any number of these people sign waivers to be involved in this movie. Because when really looking at it, I don't know how many times like Girls Gone Wild would probably have to like sign off waivers for certain things or any number of stuff. But maybe it's just like, oh no, like it was just like we just so happened to cover like during this time or whatever. Or maybe there was probably just a lot of people that are like, heck yeah, I wanted to be a part of this horror film. Like, I always wanted to be in a movie. So, like, people were easily acceptable for probably taking their tops off. And plus, also, considering that they probably did casting for this movie, probably the tons and tons of people that they were trying to cast for this film probably also asked them, hey, do you want to be a Mardi Gras extra? Because we're doing Mardi Gras, and they probably would have said, heck yeah, because they would have loved to have been involved in this horror film. So yeah, we just see a cluster of women that are easily wanting to just walk around seemingly topless. Hopefully they don't drop trout either, or they would get arrested for indecent exposure. Because I know that from like certain kind of Mardi Gras things, when you have like cops and they're doing like Mardi Gras, where it's like, well, I'm sorry, I'm gonna arrest you for indecent exposure because you took everything off. Because like you have these cops that are just kind of waiting around for certain women to basically uh, to take both off their tops and their bottoms, and then they get arrested for indecent exposure. Weirdly, so which kind of ruins the whole holiday of things, right? So pushing on. So Ben eventually is to otherwise just be like, you know what? Like all these topless women are just reminding me of the girlfriend that I broke up with because she wants space. And so Ben is kind of playing this buzzkill or Debbie Downer, and Marcus is like, "So what do you want to do, man? Like, where do you want to go?" And so Ben is like, "I want to go onto this swamp boat tour." And even in my rational mind, I would be like, dude, you're giving up all the women that are just gonna quickly show themselves to you. And you're trading that up for a swamp tour, but maybe you're gonna get some action out of that. I don't know. So Marcus gives in to Ben and it's like, you know what, you're crazy. Like, I don't want to do this with you, but since I'm your best friend, like, we're just gonna go and do this begrudgingly. So, uh, Marcus goes with Ben, and so the first boat swamp tour that they go to uh, is actually Tommy Todd, the Reverend Zombie. Okay. Uh, Tommy Todd had been in Candyman, and of course, people probably know him from that or Final Destination. And like, it's kind of interesting to see, like, oh, so this must have been easily where Holliston had pretty much got all of the cast and people from their show basically from this movie. So, like, I guess that was like an easy, like, hey guys, do you want some money? Do you want to make some money again? Like, hey, you might as well. Plus, I'm sure a lot of them just were game to be working with these people again. I think that's the real thing, was just like working on this project was so much fun that eventually they were like, heck yeah, I want to go and I want to be involved in this show because it was so much fun working with these people before. So Ben goes and asks this Reverend Zombie guy to say like, "Hey man, like you still do boat tours, right?" And the guy's like, "No. Like if anything, there was to be some guy who ended up slipping and falling and sued the out of me. So I decided that I'm never gonna do that again." And so that forces Ben and Marcus to eventually just go off and to find this guy named Sean, who is to be this swamp boat tour guy, while all of a sudden we end up having Joel Murray's character Doug Shapiro, who is to be uh, going and doing this, like, I don't know if it's like a Girls Gone Wild kind of thing, but it seems we have Misty and Jenna who are to seemingly do this movie, which I like question what it actually is. Because it seems like this guy Shapiro is to, and kind of Shapiro is kind of this like I've seen Shapiro somewhere else, or I know there was like a Shapiro like celebrity name of some kind of point. Um, like I don't know why Shapiro seems or sounds so familiar, but so we have Misty and we have Jenna who are to quickly just numerous times over just take off their top at the snap of a finger when this guy basically says so, like, well, hey, like, let's shoot a little bit more. Let's shoot you being curious or you being cautious, you're being whatever. And so Supposedly Doug Shapiro's character is to mention that he is to be this big movie executive, and what is the movie actually going to be? Because he ends up mentioning some movie that no one has ever heard of, because of course, because eventually we end up finding out who this guy actually is, which is really interesting. So, uh, so Misty and Jenna, we have them kind of doing whatever this guy says, but then eventually when he yells cut, we end up finding out that these girls are to be like seemingly like NYU girls that are gonna really try and get a real legitimate acting gig after this and all this other stuff. And so eventually Ben and Marcus going like, "Hey, swamp tour, right?" And Shauna's like, "Yeah, like let's go, let's all go onto this swamp tour." So we end up having these also these tourists who are to be Jim and Shannon, and it seems like they know so much more than Sean does while this tour is going on, to where they're like either correcting him or like they're saying their own little information, because I guess like they're people that may like want to add their own 2 cents into the tour, especially if Sean isn't exactly delivering a lot of stuff on here. So like at first we have all these people go onto this bus, and then this bus takes them to this boat. So eventually Ben is to eventually sit next to this girl named Mary Beth. And Mary Beth is this person that has nothing to want to do with Ben. And like Ben is trying to be uber nice, just like, oh, Mary Beth, that's a really nice name. It's a double name. And so then he's also just kind of mentioning like, oh, nice coat also. It's like he's going and doing the Game Grumps. If you guys know Aaron from Game Grumps, there's to be this one Mario Maker video where he is to say that like it's the early Mario Maker series where eventually he has this whole thing about there's a lot of times when he goes to parties and he really has nothing to say, and so eventually he just starts talking about a person's coat or whatever they're wearing, and eventually I think they kind of come back to that at some point to just be like, oh hey, yeah, nice coat. Just like, yeah, because what else can you really say at a party when eventually there's only like so many new movies that you can talk about? Like, hey guys, did you see the new Star Wars? Yeah. Did you like it? No. Okay, with nice coat. And supposedly Aaron like pretends that he's gonna like enter the party, and then eventually he just continuously like tries to like leave consistently. So that way he can kind of have that like second kind of run of like going in and like having these conversations with people. But anyways, so going back to the movie, so Ben is like really just failing with this woman, and so Ben is kind of turning to Marcus, and so Marcus is like, well, hopefully you have better luck with your woman, which of course ends up being the girl who consistently goes topless, who is Jenna. And there is to be this one spot when they're on the boat where all of a sudden Jenna is to be like scratching her crotchal area, and so Marcus is like, oh no, she probably has like crabs. Like, I'm not gonna be going with that woman. No. Uh, so eventually Sean is to go on this to drive this bus, and so we just end up having people. Both Jim and Shannon, who are to consistently just kind of rib this Sean guy for not knowing every tiny bit of information, but they seem to do. It seems like they had a whole brochure about this whole thing. It's like, for people, I guess, who just love to tour, you just get these people that are like having to want to know everything about where they're going, which is great. But it's also just those people that like have to like correct everybody, and I just don't like that. But anyways, so we get to this boat, And so we get on the boat, and of course, we consistently have, of course, Shapiro's character who, at specific points, are wanting these girls to get topless, and eventually, like certain kind of guys, like, ooh, yeah, like that's exciting. But then, so eventually, everyone gets on the boat, and so they go through the tour, and eventually, like Sean is to like not do the greatest job at this, but eventually his main thing is that he's going to go and show them something that looks like ghosts. And eventually they immediately just like break that down to just be like, dude, that's like gas fumes, or that like that's not ghosts. Like if anything, you basically just showed us like fog or something. Like, come on. So eventually they're heckling Sean to the point of him just getting so upset. And so all of a sudden, Victor Crawley ends up kind of like coming into the fray and then quickly leaving. And they're like, hey, what the heck is that? And so eventually Sean is like, yeah, that was the ghost. That was that was a ghost of the swamp. Yeah, like yeah, like just so he can finally justify the $30 they're gonna have to like fork over. Like this kind of feels like the Dwayne the Rock Johnson movie Jungle Cruise, where like basically he's having to repair the boat the whole time instead of actually giving people a tour of this thing. But then he ends up forcibly trying to figure out like in some goofy way to give them these action sequences so they're like enthralled about this. But he also tells them that this is like the cheapest boat tour ever. So it feels like that. So eventually what ends up happening is the boat ends up breaking down and ends up almost sinking. So we have these characters deciding to jump off the boat because they forcibly have to. Either that or this boat is going to sink. So we end up having Jim, who of course ends up, I think, jumping out of the boat first. Eventually, he lands himself into having his leg being bitten into by an alligator. And so we have Mary Beth who ends up shooting the alligator. And so now we have to kind of carry this Jim guy around, and because of course he's limping. So now eventually everybody is to just kind of jump off the boat, and like really there's no easy way to get these people rescued or whatever. It basically feels like they're effed. So but anyway, so we just start pushing on. So eventually Mary Beth at some point has to tell us the backstory of really Crowley, because she knew that it was Crowley. And so the main reason why she went on this boat tour was because supposedly Robert Englund and the guy from the early part of this movie was evidently her family, and supposedly they had died without her. Like she still doesn't know if they are dead or not. Maybe that they're still lost in this forest somewhere. And so she has to go and try to find where they are. And towards the end of this movie, she ends up finding their boat and not them. So eventually, what ends up happening is that these people start going throughout the forest, and so Mary Beth is to tell this backstory about Crowley, how him and his father were to seemingly be in the forest, just kind of minding their own beeswax. And so eventually this kid would eventually go out to town, but like be kind of covered head and toe with some kind of like rain jacket or something, because of course he's sadly disfigured. So there used to be this one time where this kid was heading to the town, and there was a bunch of kids that were to look at this kid's like face and stuff like that. And so Crowley was to scare these kids. And so to get even with the Crowley kid, these three kids decided, I guess, around Halloween, to eventually go off and toss firecrackers into this kid's in front of this kid's home, I guess, to scare him, thinking that eventually the house wouldn't burst into flames, right? Because if you toss enough firecrackers into a house, it probably won't burst into flames, right? so so this is kind of like a mixture of like Nightmare on Elm Street with the whole like the villainous character has to have his house burnt down with him in it. So that's technically like Nightmare on Elm Street, quasi somewhere close to there. So we have Kane Hodder, who is to be, of course, Mr. Crowley, uh, Crowley of Victor Crowley's, of course, father. And coincidentally, weirdly enough, he plays Crowley's father, and he also plays Crowley when he's the older version of Crowley, which is kind of interesting. So what ends up happening is Mr. Crowley is to go and try to break into his home, and I would just be like, I would be worried that somebody was gonna like burst into flames at this moment, because anything to do with fire, plus like we have it to where it's like right in front of this door is like a burst of flames, but like I'm sure it's just like, dude, like we took all kinds of precautions and whatever. So what ends up happening is we end up having Mr. Crowley go and bash through this door with a hatchet, accidentally stabbing his own son in the head. And so Crowley ends up falling over, and so this house eventually ends up burning down. Mr. Crowley ends up going into supposedly recluse, as they are to say in this movie. And so 10 years later, he ends up supposedly dying off of a broken heart because his son had died, and I guess that was the only real last part or stretch of family that Mr. Crowley had left. So, so supposedly this whole Victor Crowley character, we're either confused whether he's a ghost or just like a Friday the 13th Jason-like character that is seeking revenge. I'm like, okay, so it doesn't seem like this character has a hefty amount of like burns or something like that. Like it just looks like Crowley much older, and I'm like, okay, whatever. So because they're to keep like poking at that of whether he's a ghost or not. But I don't know, like I guess you just have like Friday the 13th like characters that are basically unstoppable anyways, so like you don't have to really justify any number of things. So eventually what happens is this tour eventually makes their way to Crowley's cabin, and I'm going to have to reset here for a second. Give me a quick second. There we go. All right. So Jim is to eventually have Marcus and Sean under his arms, but then immediately once they go and they find this cabin, immediately it switches to where Shannon is now like kind of holding on to Jim because they're like, dude, I'm not dying in this guy's arms, basically. So eventually both Jim and Shannon decide, well, what the heck, let's go closer and closer to this cabin and hope maybe there's somebody that's there that isn't Crowley. So they go closer and closer to it, and a lot of people are thinking that's a mistake. All of a sudden, Crowley goes and is to pop out of this cabin, and they're like, oh my god! So all of a sudden, we end up having Jim, who ends up getting like freaking chopped with this hatchet like on the shoulder, and he just kind of is to be like torn apart. So eventually that leads all people to just eventually start scrambling off out of pure fear. We eventually have Joel Shapiro's character that ends up just continuously running off to eventually having himself be bumping right into the Hatchet guy or Crowley guy. And so Crowley goes and takes Shapiro's head and twists it like Linda Blair from The Exorcist and kills him that way. And eventually they end up re-stumbling upon Shapiro's like I think his gear. I don't think they actually Like maybe they stumble onto his body. I think they just stumble upon his equipment, and so eventually they find out that Shapiro wasn't who he says he was. He is just some normal guy, and evidently he has played this con numerous times over. And we have Misty who's like, "Oh my god, like this is the last time that I ever fall for this," because evidently she had fell for it two other times besides this one, so this would be the third. And so all of a sudden now Marcus is to really just be so annoyed with all the lies, because Sean is to mention that uh reasonably he has only done this tour probably once or twice, and he isn't a legitimate tour guide. He just wanted to just con money out of people. And so eventually Shapiro's like, well, dude, I'm going to get my $30 back before he ends up dying. So eventually Marcus, now frustrated with the lies of all people, eventually, because we find out why Mary Beth is here. So eventually Marcus is like, anybody else have any secrets or lies that they want to tell us right now? And supposedly Jenna is to mention to this group that she never went to NYU. It was her first choice and she didn't get in, and she ended up going to some other college instead. And it's like, okay. So this girl has probably been matching this lie for so long to just get some street cred, but evidently it never really worked out. So, you would think that someone would be going into her background and kind of cement that, but I don't know. So now that Marcus has the truth of everybody, they end up just eventually just walking on, and so what eventually ends up happening is these characters eventually just continue to walk around in circles. And so eventually it leads them to this graveyard, but they just go round and round and round into circles, and eventually they're just to realize that. And so because they eventually spot the cabin yet again, and there's to also be this point where Misty is to find her phone that she dropped, and she thinks that it can get a signal, but right as the time that she's trying to text or phone anybody, she loses a signal. So eventually what ends up happening is, sadly enough, Crowley is to have this weird power sander, and so Crowley eventually grabs Jenna and power sands her face. So that's kind of horrific. And so eventually all the group is to run off into this graveyard, and we just consistently see Marcus, who's consistently being grabbed. Then he gets away. Then eventually Crowley grabs him again, and then goes and is to kind of do in wrestling terms, there is this one move called the surfboard, which is to be some submission where you to grab somebody and put their arms behind them and just kind of stretch them, and it's called a surfboard. So Crowley is to take Marcus and put him almost in this surfboard submission, and then rips off both of his arms, and so Marcus falls over because all the blood from all of his ripping arm things. So now we're down to seemingly just having Sean also died in the part where Jenna was to also die, because what ends up happening is that eventually Crowley is to drop Sean and put a shovel to Sean's neck, and of course separate his head from the rest of Sean's body. So Sean is also dead. So now, since it seems like they can't figure out where the heck else to go, Ben is just realizing, well, how about we just do this? How about we just go to the cabin? And because Ben was to find in the cabin there was some containers of gasoline. How about they just pour the gasoline on this guy and pull off like the Halloween 2 kind of thing where they try to burn this character and hope that that kind of takes down this character so they can have more time to figure out where the heck to run for their lives for. So so eventually what happens is, so Misty is kind of like the watchout, and like, oh, I guess technically Marcus was still alive at that point with um yeah, with Mary Beth. I forgot about that. So I guess this is kind of earlier in the movie than I thought. So eventually we have Crawley, who ends up tearing Misty apart, chucking her into this cabin. And so Marcus and Mary Beth are kind of calling out to this killer, like, hey, like they're heckling him. So eventually, Crowley is to get into the cabin. Mary Beth is to put this kind of a lawn utensil in the back of Crawley's head. Ben goes and tosses gasoline on him and then lights him on fire. And coincidentally, at the same time as this character is to be burnt up, all of a sudden rain is pouring down into this cabin to douse out the flames of this thing. And so they're like, dude, like we just can't catch a break. So then they run off to the graveyard. Marcus ends up getting killed. So really it just comes down to both Ben and Mary Beth just trying to figure out what the heck to do next. Because there just is seemingly no way out of taking down this character. So eventually Crowley is to take a part of this fence and rip it off. This spear of some kind, this like metal spear of some kind from this fence that's conveniently lodged in there. So everything about this movie is convenient, because why wouldn't it be? Because it's a horror film. Anyways, so I misplaced like a bit of scene in this movie, but like I'm trying to piece it all together. Or there's certain parts where I think are better pieces in this movie than others. But anyways, so pushing on. So what ends up happening is that Crowley goes after Ben and Mary Beth, puts the seemingly the metal spike through Ben's foot, and so Crowley is now running to get both Ben and Mary Beth, because he chucked this spike or this spear to put into Ben's boot. And so now they're going to bend this spear so that way Crowley can get a neck full of spear in his neck. So, because I'm going to completely mispass any of the gross parts or stuff that I just don't want to mention, because there's quite some scenes of barfing in this film, or weirdly exchanging gross fluids, which I don't even want to talk about in this film, because it's not something that I want to just like, yeah, let's talk about the gross parts, the real gross parts that probably no one wants to hear. So eventually Ben is to remove his foot seemingly from this spike, and Crowley is just now like seemingly just standing there, seemingly dead. So Ben and Mary Beth find Mary Beth's father's boat, and so they decide to go on into the, like, they are thinking that they're going to row their way back to safety, which I'm like, no, because I'm like, I've seen Friday the 13th. There's only seemingly one way for this to legitimately end. So all of a sudden we have Mary Beth and we have Ben, who it kind of feels like at this point they're kind of like they're going to become a couple after this, we would naturally assume. Mary Beth is giving Ben this thing to tie his boot on. Like, it was the one funny moment where Sean was to mention to Mary Beth about shooting the Hatchet guy or the Crowley guy. Like, yeah, if you just put 6 more bullets into him, I think he'll be good. And I was just like, really? Like, she probably has like a billion bullets into her, but if you go and you watch any action or horror film, like most of the time that'd be weirdly true, where it seems like a lot of people have absurd amount of bullets in their gun to where it rationally does not make sense. To where it's like, hey man, if you just put 20 more bullets into this guy, he'll be dead. Like as if you're gonna count him out. You just see how many bullets that this guy received already. So anyways, but they don't have a gun on them at this point. So all of a sudden, Crowley is to go and, of course, grab Mary Beth, put her into the water. And so Mary Beth is drowning. And so all of a sudden, Ben is consistently trying to put his hand in the water. Just like, Mary Beth, just grab my hand, I'll get to you. And so Mary Beth eventually is to grab on what she believes is Ben's hand, because technically it is. To eventually just be grabbing onto this hand that actually just has Crowley on Ben's hand, because Crowley had ripped off Ben's hand to put into the water. And so now we're just naturally assuming that Ben is dead at this point, and so is Murray Beth. And the movie just ends on this like cliffhanger like moment where we're to just naturally assume everyone was to get killed off, hence why they made other Hatchet movies. But yeah, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.